I first saw her in the low amber light of an alley, half hidden by stacked crates and the sour reek of spilled whiskey. A warped canvas sagged over a rust-eaten cage, the kind you'd pen a mean dog in. Only this wasn't a dog. She was curled in the corner, arms around her knees, a torn dress clinging to her like a bad memory. Her eyes found mine through the iron bars, steady but hollow, like she was taking my measure and didn't care much for the result. I stood there longer than was polite, long enough to know she wasn't waiting for rescue. She'd stopped waiting for anything. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Emery Kane. I was born in a clapboard house my father built with his own hands on a patch of red soil 10 miles west of the Brazos. We raised longhorns and patched our boots more times than we bought new ones. Sundays were for church, when the circuit preacher rode through, and for mending fences when he didn't. My folks taught me to keep my word, lend a hand before being asked, and never walk past a man in trouble without seeing if there was something you could do. We measured wealth in sound cattle, good neighbors, and a roof that kept the rain off, not in the shine of coin. By the time I was grown, the railroad had pushed closer, dragging with it speculators, mining outfits, and saloon men who could drain a man's pockets faster than a flash flood. Elkhorn Bluff was one of those towns that sprang up overnight and seemed to rot just as quick. There was a saloon, a store, a blacksmith, and a jail that hadn't seen a prisoner in years, because trouble was better business when you kept it at the bar. I stayed clear of town more often than not. My land was enough work for 2 men, and I was only one. The last time I'd come in, I meant to trade for nails and a sack of flour. I wasn't looking for anything else. But the alley behind Mercer's place pulled my attention the way a coyote's cry cuts through a still night. That's when I saw the cage and the woman inside it. Folks called her the girl, but I could tell she'd seen more years and harder days than that word gave her credit for. The set of her jaw told me she'd learned not to beg. The bruises told me she'd been given reasons not to try. I didn't know yet how she'd come to be there, or why Mercer kept her penned like an animal. But I knew enough about men like him to reckon it wasn't for her own good. The late sun threw long shadows down that alley, stretching over the dirt like fingers. I remember thinking the day was about to tip into something I couldn't turn back from. Then the saloon door banged open, and Mercer himself stepped out, a sly smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had something in his hand, glinting in the light. Josiah Mercer stepped out of the saloon with the evening light behind him, dust rising under his boots. The grin on his face didn't reach his eyes, and in his right hand was a ring of keys that jingled against his vest buttons. He stopped just short of the cage, tilting his head as if measuring my intent. "She's no use to you," he said, his voice pitched low, half for me and half for the men loitering near the door. I didn't answer. The heat of the day was fading, but the air between us stayed tight as a drawn rope. He worked his jaw, muttered something about gold, then shoved the keys against my chest hard enough to rattle them. I crouched in front of the lock, the iron warm from the sun. Through the bars, Maybelle's eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. "I won't touch you," I said, keeping my voice even. "You walk or you don't, but I'm opening it." The old bolt gave way with a rough squeal, and the door swung wide. I stepped back, letting the space between us breathe. She stayed where she was. At first her arms cinched around her knees, every line of her body tight as fence wire. Then, slow as water creeping through sand, she uncurled, used the side of the cage to pull herself up, and stepped outside. We left the alley without a word. The last of the sun was sliding behind the low ridge west of town, throwing long shadows across the main street. We passed the church with its roof half gone, the blacksmith shop with its forge cold, and the last board fences before the scrub took over. The mule's ears flicked at the reins as I guided the wagon onto the trail, the wheels bumping over ruts that had been there all summer. She sat in back, wrapped in an old blanket I'd handed her without comment. The road bent between dry creek beds and wind-scoured sage, the air cooling with the light. By the time my place came into view, the sky had turned that deep blue that comes just before night. The house sat low against the land, one story with a tin roof that had seen better seasons. The barn leaned at one corner and the clothesline hung slack between two posts. No smoke from the chimney, no livestock in sight, only the stillness of a place left too long without laughter. I pulled up by the barn, stepped down, and walked to the front door. The hinges protested as I pushed it open, then held it for her. She crossed the threshold barefoot, the blanket still around her shoulders. Inside the room was plain, a stone hearth, blackened by years of use, a scarred table with two chairs, a narrow bed near the fire, and dust hanging in the corners. "That one's yours?" I said, pointing to the bed. I lit a single oil lamp from the shelf and set it down. She stood in the center of the room, eyes moving over the space, her hands twitching like they needed work to do. I left her to it, stepping into the side room to pull off my boots and fill the basin. When I came back, I set a biscuit from the tin on the table, poured 2 cups of weak coffee, and motioned to hers with a flick of my fingers. She didn't touch it right away, just watched as I ate, her gaze darting to my hands, my face the torn sleeve of her own dress. I didn't stare at the bruises. I kept my eyes low on the tin cup in my hand. When the biscuits were gone, I told her the outhouse was out back, then stepped outside into the moonlit yard. She followed later, her bare feet soundless on the hard-packed dirt. I was by the corral working a gate hinge by lantern light when she passed on her way back in. The night carried the scent of dry grass and a hint of juniper from the draws. When I returned to the house, a clean shirt was gone from the shelf, and a pair of women's boots, whole but worn, were missing from beside the hearth. I didn't say anything. She had her bed, her shirt, and her boots now. I left the door cracked a few inches against the night and took my seat on the porch, rifle across my lap, watching the moon clear the ridge. Morning came sharp and dry. A hawk called overhead as she stepped outside, boots on her feet, the blanket folded over her arm. I was at the corral again, sleeves rolled, mending a fence rail. She walked to the barn and disappeared inside. After a time, I heard the scrape of a broom on the plank floor. By the time I came to the doorway, she was still sweeping, her head bent to the work. "You hungry?" I asked. She looked up and I handed her a plate with 2 biscuits and a fried egg. Nothing fancy, but real food. She took it without a word, and I went back to the rail. Later, she stood in the doorway, watching me split wood. The sun was higher than the heat settling in. She fetched water from the pump without being asked and set the buckets by the back step. I saw her lift a hand to her brow and wipe it with the edge of her sleeve. When I passed by later, I set a folded rag on the windowsill where she'd been sitting. She found it. That evening, the smell of stew met me when I stepped inside. She'd found the potatoes and onions, salted the meat, and boiled it slow. I pulled out a chair and sat. We ate in the quiet, the fire low behind us. Afterward, she cleared the bowls while I fixed a hinge on the front door. The third night brought rain, just enough to dampen the roof and carry the scent of wet earth through the open windows. I was on the porch with my rifle when she came out, boots, damp blanket around her shoulders. She sat at the far edge, and for a long while we listened to the tin roof and the distant call of a coyote. "I didn't think it would rain again," she said. "Usually don't," I answered. She asked who built the place, and I told her my boy and I had, back when my wife was still alive. Fever took her, flood took him. She didn't press for more. Then she told me she had been in that cage 19 days. Her voice caught at the end, but she held my gaze. "You ain't there now," I said, the only truth that mattered at that moment. She pulled the blanket tighter. The next day, I noticed her eyes following the way I moved, catching the stiffness in my ribs when I bent to lift something heavy. By midday, she was at my side by the barn, her voice steady. "You do have someone else," she said me. She worked with me on the ladder, holding boards steady while I hammered. When I caught my knuckle, she had a rag and water before I'd sat down. Her hands were sure as she wrapped the scrape with a strip of cloth torn from an old curtain. "Stop favoring your ribs," she said. "I see it." That evening she cooked again, setting the table with 2 bowls, 2 forks, and a folded cloth between. Halfway through the meal she said, "You were right. It's not a cage," I told her. I didn't figure she'd believe that the first night. "I didn't," she said. When the dishes were done, we stepped onto the porch. The air was cooling, the sky running to purple. She asked, "Why me?" I told her I'd seen too many walk by pain like it was trash. And I didn't want to be one more. "Most don't stop for girls like me," she said. "You ain't a girl anymore, and you ain't broken," I told her. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the stars came out. The next morning, a deep cough rattled my chest before I'd finished boiling coffee. She crossed the room quickly, set water in front of me, and was at the pantry before I could speak. She pulled out what herbs. We had a jar of honey mustard seed and whiskey, setting a pot to boil. She pressed the warm poultice to my chest, her hand steady against the heat of my skin. When I told her she didn't have to, she said "I know" and didn't stop. By nightfall, the fever was easing. She told me her name, then Maybelle. I said it was a good name. We ate stew side by side at the short end of the table, our hands brushing once when I reached for the salt. I didn't move mine away, and neither did she. After the meal, she untied my boots, folded a blanket over my legs, and when she turned to go, I caught her hand. She knelt again, this time closer, and put her palm to my cheek. Our foreheads touched first, then our lips. It was steady, unhurried, the kind of thing that stays. She said I didn't have to follow her, and I told her I wanted to. We slept in the back room that night, the rain gone, the land quiet under the stars. Morning came easy, the air cool, the smell of coffee drifting from the stove. We sat on the porch with our mugs, her knee close to mine. That's when the sound of hooves carried from the trail, and a wagon rolled into view, dust rising around it. Josiah's wagon rolled to a stop 20 yards from the porch, the horses blowing steam into the cool morning air. Dust hung low over the trail behind them. He stood on the buckboard, red vest catching the light, a chain from his watch glinting against it. 2 men flanked him, one with the worn look of a ranch hand, the other with a pistol low on his belt and a squint that measured distances. Josiah climbed down, slow boots thudding against the packed earth, and started forward with that half-smile that always seemed more about himself than the person he was facing. "I came to collect what's mine," he said. Voice pitched smooth. I stepped off the porch, placing myself between him and Maybelle. "What you sold ain't yours anymore," I told him. His smile twitched, but he didn't stop walking. "Sold, just leased her. No paper says she's free, no kin to claim her. Makes her mine in the eyes that matter." He let his gaze shift past me toward her like she was something he'd misplaced. I moved my coat aside just enough for the morning light to catch the steel on my hip. "She stays because she wants to," I said. Josiah's eyes narrowed, his head angling slightly toward the man with the gun. That man's hand rested near his belt, but he didn't draw. The air felt like the moment before a summer storm. "She's not property," I added. "Not yours, not mine. Free." Maybelle stepped forward, then just far enough to be seen clear. She was in the shirt I'd given her, sleeves rolled, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her stance was steady, her eyes fixed on Josiah. "I'm me," she said, her voice carrying without strain. Josiah held her gaze a moment, then looked away, muttering as he turned back toward the wagon. "Not worth the trouble," he said. He hauled himself up to the seat, snapped the reins, and the wagon turned back down the trail. The hired gun spat in the dirt before following. When the sound of hooves faded, I looked over at her. "You all right?" She nodded, though I could see the tremor in her hands. We didn't speak of it again. Instead, we went to the fence line, working in the steady rhythm the land demands. lifting rails, driving nails, hauling water from the pump. By midday, a stray chicken wandered out from the brush, scratching at the dirt like it had lived here all along. She laughed once, quick and quiet, the sound cutting through the heat. That evening, we sat by the fire with our chairs pulled close. She worked a needle through a tear in her skirt, and my hand rested on her knee. No words needed filling the space between us. The next days followed in much the same way, the quiet only broken by the work itself, the clang of a hammer, the creak of the barn door, the soft splash of water in the basin. Each night the hills faded into darkness, and the lamp inside threw its warm circle across the table. A week after Josiah's visit, a letter came by way of a freighter stopping for water at the creek. He handed it over without a word, tipping his hat before driving on. The envelope was creased and smudged from travel, the name written in a hand I didn't know. I set it on the table between us, the firelight flickering against the ink. Maybelle's eyes followed it, then met mine. Outside, the wind pressed against the side of the house, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the first hint of rain. The envelope lay between us on the table, its edges worn from travel, the ink smudged in places where hands had handled it too many times. Maybelle sat across from me, her sewing untouched, her eyes fixed on the paper, as if the words inside might slip away if she looked elsewhere. I slid it toward her, the faint scratch of paper on wood loud in the quiet room. She didn't open it right off, just set her palm flat over it, thumb brushing the corner. When she did break the seal, the sound of the paper tearing felt sharper than it ought to. Her eyes moved over the page slowly, her brow drawing tight. I waited, watching the lamplight shift across her face. After a long moment, she lowered the letter. "It's from someone I used to know," she said, her voice steady but low. "A man named Owen Price." She said the name like she was testing how it felt after years unsaid. She told me Owen had worked alongside the preacher who'd raised her back before the fire. The letter said he'd heard talk in Elkhorn Bluff. Mercer wasn't content to leave things be. He'd been in touch with men downriver, passing her name around in the sort of circles where trouble grows fast. There was mention of a claim, some false paper that could be waved in front of a lawman willing to look the other way. Maybelle folded the letter once, twice, setting it back on the table. The lines at the corners of her eyes were deeper in the lamplight. "He says he can't get involved more than sending word. He's got his own freight run and family to think about," she said. I nodded, understanding more than I liked to. In this country, a warning was already more than most would risk. The wind outside picked up, tapping a loose board against the side of the house. I stood and stoked the fire, letting the flames catch and settle. Maybelle stayed at the table, turning the folded letter in her hands. When I sat again, she looked at me directly. "If Mercer's stirring things up, it won't stop at talk," she said. Her tone was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who'd learned to take small signs seriously. We agreed to keep on as we had, but with an eye on the road. The next morning, I took to checking the fence line early, looking for fresh tracks. Maybelle worked in the garden patch near the side of the house, her braids swinging against her back as she bent to pull weeds. She didn't look up when I passed, but I knew she'd be listening for more than just the wind. That afternoon, clouds built over the ridge, throwing the light into a gray that made the land seem closer. I was in the barn sorting tools when Maybelle came to the doorway, the letter in her pocket. "If Mercer's working through others, we need to know who," she said. I leaned on the workbench, meeting her gaze. "I can ask around in town," I offered. She shook her head. "Too soon. Better to wait for him to make the next move. If he thinks we're settled, he'll show his hand." We left it at that, each of us taking on our own quiet watch. Days passed without sign of riders or wagons on the trail. The only visitors were a pair of deer that came to drink from the trough one dawn, their ears twitching at every sound. The air stayed cool, the kind that carries far-off noise. At night, We could hear coyotes on the far side of the ridge, their calls carrying under the moon. One evening, as we finished supper, the lamp sputtered low. I trimmed the wick and poured more oil, and that's when I heard it hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the creek. Maybelle's eyes found mine, and she set her fork down. The sound grew clearer, the rhythm steady, not hurried. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to sneak up, but they weren't bringing company either. I stepped to the porch, the boards cool under my boots, and watched the dark line of the trail. A single rider emerged, the shape of a wide-brimmed hat, clear against the last strip of twilight. He held the reins loose, one hand resting on the horn of the saddle. The horse moved at an easy walk, breath puffing white in the cooling air. The rider slowed as he neared the gate, lifting a hand in greeting, but not speaking yet. I waited, one hand resting near the porch rail. Maybelle came to stand in the doorway behind me, the lamplight catching in her hair. The horse stopped a few yards from the porch, and the man straightened in the saddle. "Evenin'," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach us. "Name's Owen Price. Figure you've been expecting I might show." Owen reined his horse in just shy of the porch, the leather creaking under his weight as he swung down. He was tall-shouldered, still carrying the frame of a trail driver, though the years had settled into the lines around his eyes. Dust clung to his coat and hat brim, the kind a man collects after a long ride without pause. He tied the reins to the gatepost, patted the horse's neck, and stepped forward with the slow confidence of someone who'd been on more front steps than he could count. I met him at the edge of the porch. His handshake was firm but not rushed. Maybelle stood just inside the doorway, the lamplight framing her, her eyes never leaving him. "Got your letter," I said. He nodded. Figured it'd be better to bring the rest in person. His voice had the gravel of long days in the saddle and nights by the fire with too little coffee left in the pot. Inside, the three of us took seats around the table. Owen kept his hat on his knee, turning it slow while he spoke. "Mercer's been talking to a man named Hollis Tate," he said. "Runs freight along the southern routes, but that's not all he runs. He's got friends in the kind of places you don't want to be known." I didn't interrupt. Maybelle's hands were still, her gaze fixed on Owen. "What would Mercer want with him?" she asked. Owen looked at her, the pause deliberate. "Paperwork," he said. "Hollis knows how to put ink on a page that can make a lie look official. I've seen him do it with land deeds, contracts, even court filings when there's a judge willing to play along." The fire cracked low in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, hissing against the siding. "If Mercer can show something that says you owe him time or money, some sheriff in his pocket might try to make it stick," Owen added. He leaned back, the chair creaking. "I don't think he's ready yet. But he's laying track." We sat with that for a moment. Then Maybelle spoke, her voice even. "So what do we do?" Owen shook his head. "I can't get in the middle of it past giving you warning. But if you see Tate's wagon or hear his name, you'd best be ready to push back before the papers do the talking." I walked Owen out to his horse when the talk was done. He cinched the saddle, checked the cinch again, then swung up. "Watch the road west," he said, looking down at me. "If Tate comes, he'll use that way less law to trip over." He tipped his hat toward Maybelle, who stood in the doorway. Then he turned his horse toward the dark stretch of trail, the sound of hooves fading into the night. The days after his visit carried a sharper edge. Chores went on as always, but my eyes were on the horizon more than the work in front of me. Maybelle kept close to the house, mending gear, tending the garden, and making sure the water barrels stayed full. Once I caught her watching the road through the narrow gap between the shutters, her face unreadable. One morning I rode out to check the far fence. The air was cool, the kind that carried sound. From the ridge I could see the trail west, stretching in both directions, empty, but for a hawk circling high. When I got back, Maybelle was on the porch, a small basket of laundry at her feet. "No sign?" she asked. I shook my head. She didn't press. It was near sundown 2 days later when the first hint came. A wagon wheel track cut across the road by the creek, fresh sharp edges in the dirt pointing west to east. I crouched, running my hand along the rut. The spacing was wide, the kind used on heavier freighters. Back at the house, I told Maybelle what I'd seen. She listened, then set down the pot she'd been carrying to the stove. "Could be anyone," she said. I nodded. Could be. But we both knew how few wagons came from that direction without reason. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the loose hinge on the barn door. I went out to fasten it, the lantern light pooling across the yard. When I turned back, I saw Maybelle at the window, the glow from inside catching her face. She stayed there until I stepped in. The next morning, I hitched the mule and rode into town for supplies. Elkhorn Bluff was its usual self. 3 men at the saloon porch. A boy sweeping dust in front of the store, the blacksmith's hammer ringing steady. I bought flour, coffee, and nails, then asked the storekeep, Miles Grant, if he'd seen Tate come through. He paused just long enough to be noticed. "Might have been a wagon like that couple days ago," he said. Didn't stop long. Bought kerosene and tobacco, then kept east. I thanked him and left without more talk. The ride back felt longer, the sun low and the land quiet in a way that made each sound stand out. The creak of harness, the soft clop of hooves, the wind running through dry grass. When I reached the homestead, Maybelle was splitting kindling by the woodpile. She looked up as I came through the gate. "He's been through," I said. She set the axe aside, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Then we watch." Her voice was steady, but her eyes stayed on the road beyond my shoulder. That night we ate in silence, the fire throwing shadows against the walls. Outside, the air was still. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. I set my coffee down, the sound of the cup against the table louder than it should have been. Maybelle's gaze flicked toward the door. Whatever was coming, it was on its way, and we both knew it. By the 4th morning after spotting Tate's wagon track, the air had turned sharp enough to carry sound from a long way off. I was mending a bridle strap by the corral when I heard the faint grind of wheels on hard earth. Maybelle was on the porch peeling potatoes into a basin, her eyes lifting to the sound before I said a word. The noise grew steadier, the rhythm of hooves joining it. I set the bridle down, wiping my hands on my trousers. The wagon came into view past the stand of juniper broad wheels, canvas top, a dark team pulling slow. A man rode at the front, thick-shouldered with a hat brim pulled low enough to shadow his face. Even from a distance, I knew it was Hollis Tate. He pulled up just short of the gate, the horses blowing hard in the chill. Looking for a place to water, he called, his voice carrying with a practiced ease. I walked to the fence and leaned on the top rail. "Plenty of creek behind you," I said. He smiled without showing teeth. "Thought I might find friendlier company here than down there." Maybelle had stepped off the porch and stood a few paces behind me. Tate's eyes flicked her way before coming back to mine. "Heard Mercer's name tied to this place," he said lightly, as though it were casual talk. Thought I'd see if it was true. I didn't answer right away, letting the space stretch. "Nothing here for Mercer," I said finally. Tate shifted in his seat, hands loose on the reins. Could be not. Man like him tends to finish what he starts. His gaze slid past me toward the yard, the barn, the stacked wood by the side of the house. "Good spot you've got." "You've watered enough," I told him. His smile flattened. He gave a small tug on the reins, and the wagon creaked back into motion. As it passed, I saw a second man riding in the shadow of the canvas, eyes scanning the place without a word. The sound of the team faded toward town. We went about our work that day without speaking much on it. Maybelle kept her hands busy in the kitchen, though I caught her glancing out the window toward the trail more than once. By evening, the clouds were piling heavy over the ridge, and the smell of rain edged the air. After supper, I stepped onto the porch. The wind was up, carrying the faint glow of lamps from somewhere down the trail. Maybelle joined me, her shawl pulled close. "He'll tell Mercer," she said quietly. I nodded. "Then we get ahead of it." The next morning, I saddled the mule and rode into town. Elkhorn Bluff felt tighter than usual. Folks talking in pairs near the store, the saloon door swinging with steady traffic. I tied off outside the blacksmith's and went in under the pretense of needing a new hinge. Miles Grant was inside weighing out nails. He didn't look up when he said, "Tate's been asking about you." I carried the supplies out without answering and saw across the street Tate himself talking with Josiah Mercer on the saloon porch. Mercer leaned against a post, head tilted, while Tate spoke low. When Tate spotted me, he tipped his hat with that same smile from the day before. I didn't linger. The ride home was under a sky the color of iron, the wind pushing at my back. Maybelle was splitting wood when I came through the gate. I told her what I'd seen, and she set the axe aside. "He's not hiding it anymore," she said. We spent the rest of the day securing what we could. Checking the barn doors, making sure the tools were stowed, moving the water barrels under cover. It was the kind of work that speaks more than the words around it. By nightfall, the first drops of rain began to tap against the roof. Inside, the fire was going strong. We sat at the table, the map of the county spread between us. I pointed out the trails Mercer might use if he meant to come himself. Maybelle traced one with her finger. "This one," she said. "He'd come by the low pass. Easier to hide a wagon there." We agreed to watch that route come morning. As the rain thickened, the sound filled the spaces between our words. Before turning in, I checked the porch rifle and set it within easy reach of the door. Maybelle's eyes followed the motion, but she didn't speak. The storm lasted most of the night, wind rattling the shutters. At first light, the clouds had broken, leaving the land washed and still. I stepped out, scanning the ridge beyond the low pass. Somewhere in that silence, the next move was taking shape, and I meant to see it before it reached our door. The rain left the ground soft underfoot, and by mid-morning the sun had burned the last of the clouds away. I was tightening the corral gate when Maybelle stepped out with a tin cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the low pass. She didn't hand me the cup right away, just nodded toward the ridge. A single rider was coming through the glint of sunlight, catching on metal at his hip. We watched in silence until the shape became clear. Josiah Mercer sat tall in the saddle, his coat drawn back just enough to show the grip of his revolver. Behind him, two men followed, one I didn't know the other. The same shadow-faced hand who'd ridden with Tate's wagon. They came on at a steady walk, no hurry, no caution, as if they meant the whole land to see them arrive. I set the cup on the post and stepped to the porch. Maybelle stayed where she was. Her arms folded, the sun touching the line of her jaw. Mercer reined in at the gate, looking over the yard like it was something he'd already bought. "You've had time to think on my offer," he said, his voice smooth enough to slide off a man if he didn't know better. "You didn't make one," I told him. "You just came to take." His smile twitched. "Call it what you like. She belongs with me. That's the truth of it." He shifted in the saddle, his gaze flicking toward Maybelle. "Ain't no law says otherwise." "There's a law here," I said, "and it's standing in front of you." I stepped down off the porch and closed the space between us to the fence line. His men watched when resting a hand on the stock of his rifle. The yard was so quiet I could hear the harness leather creak when Mercer moved. Maybelle's voice cut through from behind me, even and clear. "I'm not property, and I'm not yours." She stepped down from the porch, coming to stand at my side. Her eyes were steady, her hands empty. Mercer's smile went thin. "You'll change your mind," he said. I shook my head. "Not while I'm breathing." I let my coat fall open so the colt at my hip showed plain. The man with the rifle shifted his weight, but Mercer held him back with a small lift of his hand. For a long breath, No one moved. Then Mercer leaned back in the saddle, the decision made. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, turning his horse. They rode out the way they'd come, their shadows stretching long across the road. We stood there until the dust settled, the only sound the wind in the grass. Maybelle looked at me, and I could see the strain in her shoulders ease. "He'll try again," she said. "Then we'll be ready," I answered. That afternoon we worked side by side, mending the south fence, our hands moving in the quiet rhythm of habit. The air held the clean scent left by the rain, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk called. When the sun dropped, we carried the tools in and lit the lamp. The house felt smaller in the evening stillness, but the fire's glow was steady. Over supper, neither of us spoke much. We didn't have to. The scrape of spoons against the bowls and the low pop of the fire said enough. After the dishes were cleaned and set to dry, I stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear now, the stars sharp above the dark line of the hills. Maybelle joined me, her shawl around her shoulders. She stood close enough that I could feel her warmth through the cool air. Down the trail, a flicker of light moved, too steady for a campfire, too low for a star. I watched it until it passed behind the ridge. "Lantern on the road?" I said quietly. She nodded once, her hand brushing mine. Whatever was coming next, it was closer than it had been this morning. The lantern light we'd seen the night before turned out to be Sheriff Darnell riding in from the county seat, his horse lathered from the push. He dismounted slow, but his eyes told me there was no time to waste. Word had come by telegraph Josiah Mercer was in custody. Seems he'd pushed too far in another town, tried to strong-arm a widow out of her land, and ran headlong into a circuit judge who didn't take kindly to threats. The trial was swift, held in the town hall under the glow of oil lamps. Folks packed in shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with dust and anticipation. Maybelle sat beside me, her chin high, the light catching the calm steel in her eyes. When the judge read the verdict, the sound of boots shifting on the plank floor filled the pause, guilty on all counts. Mercer's face gave nothing away, but his hands were clenched tight as rope knots. Outside, the night air felt cooler, and the stars seemed nearer than they had in weeks. Maybelle stood a moment on the boardwalk, breathing it in. "It's done," she said quietly. I nodded, though I knew some scars would take longer to fade. Still, the land was ours to tend, without fear, and that was no small thing. The days that followed settled into a rhythm again. We mended fence saw to the stock and rode into town on Saturdays for supplies. At the trading post, folks greeted Maybelle with respect, now not pity or speculation. She answered each with a steady smile, as if she'd been rooted here all her life. One Sunday after church, we walked the edge of the pasture. The grass bent in the wind, carrying the scent of sage. She paused at the rise where the view stretched for miles, ridges rolling into the horizon, the river cutting silver through the lowlands. "Feels like home," she said. I knew she meant more than the land. Life on the frontier never promised ease. But it offered something better if a person could hold on, room to stand, room to breathe, room to build something worth keeping. We'd faced down storms, hunger, and men like Mercer, and still we stood. That was the measure of it. If there's a lesson in it, maybe it's this: strength isn't always loud, and justice doesn't always ride in with guns drawn. Sometimes it's in the quiet choices, the steady hands, and the people who stay when others turn away. And if you've ever had to fight for your place in the world, you'll know the worth of it when you win. Think on that, and if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who'd understand.